still squint as I used to when I remember the bright sun on the sand. I thought it was the brightest light I had ever seen. Much of the evening conversation was about the trip and how many flat tires we did or didn't have. Of course, when you had a flat tire, you fixed it right there from a kit you always carried with you. The tires had inner tubes, and you would cut a patch from the kit the size you thought you needed and put a rubber cement on both the patch and the inner tube and place the patch on the inner tube and press real hard so that it wouldn't come off, and then you would put some kind of a powder over it so it wouldn't stick to the to the rest of the tire when you put the inner tube back into the tire and pumped it up with a tire pump. We had sort of a game on the road. Each make of car had a distinctive radiator and hood, and we would see who could spot and name the make first. I think I was allowed to win most of the time. I had measles and chicken pox, and I think maybe whooping cough. When I had the measles, all the shades were pulled to keep it dark so my eyes wouldn't be affected. When you had those diseases and other contagious diseases like scarlet fever and diphtheria, the doctor, who of course made house calls, tacked a cardboard sign with the name of the sickness by the outside door to warn people, so if they hadn't had the disease, they wouldn't enter. I still have my chickenpox sign, I think, in a baby book. Also, a floral piece would be placed by the door when someone had passed away. On a happier note, on May Day, May 1st, children would knock on the door, and after placing a little basket, usually made from wallpaper and filled with flowers, they would put it on the doorknob and would try to get away before being seen. I'm really jumping around. These memories came to me after I got in bed one night, and I got up twice and jotted them down, as I was sure I would forget them by morning. Friday night, Mother would put navy beans to soak, and all Saturday morning they would cook with salt pork, and we would have bean soup for lunch. In the afternoon, she would put the rest of the beans in a baking dish with the salt pork, the brown sugar, and onions, and bake them for supper. She baked bread in the morning while Dad and I went out to Wyrick's farm and got homemade cottage cheese that was yellow with cream. And we'd come home and put that on slices of warm bread and eat it with our bean soup. I'm sure this didn't happen every Saturday, but enough times to make an impression. In the fall, we would go to the same farm and get the apples that were stored in the pit. There were Northern Spies, Kings, Jonathans, Sheep Nose, shaped sort of like our Delicious, but not as plump or red, but oh, so much better tasting. And snow apples, small and bright red on the outside and snow white inside. Those were some of the names I remember. There would be full bushels of some and a half bushel or a quarter bushel of others. We also got cider there, and folks would laugh and say it was especially good because worms and all went into the press this time. Grandpa Pugsley would stop by some cold winter Saturdays and put his feet on the floor register. That's the only kind we had. It was a coal-burning furnace. We'd give him an apple and a knife, and he would start peeling, round and round, from one end to the other, without breaking that long spiral rope. Then slice the apple and eat it. I can remember standing and watching and hoping it wouldn't break, and I don't think it ever did. In the summer, Dad would order coal for the winter, so many tons, some hard coal and some soft because it would ignite better. A truck would come and put a chute in the basement window and dump the coal into the bin. And if it was a good deliver person, he would put up some kind of curtains so that the coal dust wouldn't go every place. I never wanted breakfast, but Mother insisted. She'd fix a shredded wheat biscuit. She would put hot water on it, drain that off, and put butter, brown sugar, and a little milk on it. I'd eat it, I guess. I don't remember too much about entree-type foods, but our desserts were mostly home canned fruit that had been canned in season, and cookies. Dad always said, why spoil good fruit by putting them in pies? One dessert Dad and I especially liked, Mother would slice apples in the bottom of a baking dish, put a biscuit dough on top, and bake it, and serve it with milk that had sugar and nutmeg in it. Oh yes, we did always have oyster stew on Christmas Eve. The stew was okay, but I never ate the oysters. Funny I could take milk those two ways, but I could never drink it. There was a special Christmas treat. I guess it was special, for that was the only time you could get it. Seeded raisins, not seedless, seeded. They were grapes dried right on the bunch as it was picked off the vine. They were packed in coarse sawdust, so they had to be washed good. I never thought they were so special because you had to eat the seeds too, but we always had them. Little red pillow-like anise drops and ribbon candy was always in the house at Christmas time too. I told you this wouldn't be a very professional job. Since I started this, I heard of a couple at church here in Tucson that took 18 months to do their memories. And they have a regular book with pictures. The man got so enthused he has offered to teach a class in writing up memories. And another man interested in what I had said I was doing is now methodically organizing his. Makes me feel I should have done mine differently, but I console myself by saying they're younger than I am. Historical dates and events have never meant much to me. Like I have said many times, my mind seems to be full of trivia, and I just jotted down things as I remembered them. But I think you'll have to agree this is a lot of remembering for the first 9 years of my life, all in Three Rivers, as we moved to Michigan City in 1920. With everyone, an aunt, uncle, grandma, or grandpa, whether a relative or not, and all the family activities who needed radios or TVs. When I think back to our days in Three Rivers, the word quiet seems to come to mind. Sure, people had to be to work and school on time, and home for lunch, and back again, and of course to church, but no one seemed to be in a hurry. The beautiful maple trees and elm trees that made a quiet, cool arch over most of the streets, the quiet snowfalls, the mud and slush in the spring. Funny, I don't recall the colored leaves in the fall, which have given me so much enjoyment now. I do remember piles of brown leaves that had been raked up every time we went to Three Rivers. It was just a friendly place to start my 84 years. Most of it I remember as a child, but maybe the trees I appreciated more on our visits back to see Uncle Leo and Aunt Fern up to through the time when I had my own children. Well, Dad was told by the doctors that he had to get away from a desk job and be outdoors more. And Uncle Frank was building cottages on the beach and asked Dad to come and help. Uncle Frank really didn't like the building business, and so in a couple of years, Dad took over, drawing plans and bidding on jobs and working with his crew of carpenters. He even made his own blueprints. His green Dodge truck was going from morning till night. But our trip to live in Michigan City was hard. I don't know how the furniture went, and I don't remember how much or where it was stored, but we had that library table. But the car was loaded, just barely enough room for me in the back seat. Of course, there were no trunks in cars those days. No one spoke a word until partway there I saw this shiny stuff on the floor around my feet. What a mess. The container holding some of the molasses-like stuff, only far more viscous, that Dad had gotten at Battle Creek and was supposed to eat, had leaked. And all we could do was try to keep other things from getting into it, because it couldn't get cleaned up without water and a lot of work. Well, it broke the spell. It was to be a whole new life for me, leaving Three Rivers with its three rivers, Portage, Rocky, and St. Joe, to wonderful Lake Michigan with its more promising playground. Guess I should record that Uncle Frank's brother, Orry Glidden, with a man by the name of Mr. Gatto, developed the beach. When Dad appeared, people assumed he was another brother. He certainly didn't resemble them, as they were heavy-set, and Dad was a small man. Anyway, Dad's sister, Laura Glidden, had married Frank Glidden. Their grandfathers, I guess, were half-brothers. After a while, you just didn't try to explain it to people. You just let it go. It must have been in late summer when we moved, so we would have gone to Live Oak with Uncle Frank and Aunt Laura. And Live Oak, the place they lived in the summer. It was on a hill, and the front porch was in the trees, and the back porch a few steps off the ground. I'll talk about our living there for probably 3 more summers before we had a place of our own. Grandma Glidden had moved to Michigan City sometime before we did, and she had one bedroom in the house and Uncle Frank the other. The porch was quite long and wide, and Dad and Mother slept on a cot that could be made into a double bed at the west end. Aunt Laura on a cot right up next to the screen in the middle of the porch. She had respiratory problems and had to have lots of air. And I had a couch sort of across from her next to the wall. The couch had a gradually raised head, and I always wondered if that's what started me humping over. There was another cot at the east end, and when it was real hot, Uncle Frank would sleep on it. We had our meals out there, too, on a big table. I remember slices of cantaloupe, huge cantaloupe. And they were shaped with indentations so you knew right where to slice them. And we always had them for dessert in the summertime. And Aunt Laura made her spice cookies in a flat pan and cut them into squares. She said it didn't take so long that way. On quiet, rainy days, when the men didn't have inside work, we sat on the porch and played rook. I wouldn't know how in the world it was played today. I can remember getting sprayed with rain if the wind came up at night. But we would just put oilcloth over the beds and stay right there. Sure wished we'd had something like plastic. We had an instantaneous gas water heater that went on when you turned on the hot water faucet, and you had hot water instantly. I've never heard of one before or since. As I said, Uncle Frank didn't like the business, so he spent his time in a good-sized garden, and with 100 or more chickens. He sold eggs to summer resorters, around 25 cents a dozen. The garden and chicken coop were all behind live oak. Aunt Laura had lots of cats. Her favorite was Toddy, a black and white cat that became a mommy many times, and Aunt Laura would put the litter to sleep unless there was one she really liked. So lots of times we had 2 and 3 cats around. We thought cats were the reason she had respiratory problems, but of course we didn't say anything. We would stay quite late in the fall and just put more covers over us, but we ate inside where there was a fireplace for warmth. One morning I went out to Lakeshore Drive to catch the little jitney bus for school. It was had a little wooden body and seats along the side that held about 8 people. The driver apparently forgot me as I saw it turn around way down towards town. I went back to the house, and because there was no one around with a car, Mother and I went back to the road, and she flagged down a car. It was the president of the Citizens Bank, Mr. Vail, and his wife, and they took me right to school. I had 2 girlfriends that lived next to us in Glen Oak during the summer, Jane and Margaret Crotto. They were from Chicago and rented the same cottage every year. I must have been jealous of their worldliness and their self-confidence or something, and wanted to get their attention. So after I had been back to Three Rivers for a visit, I made up a story about having been to the doctor and was going to have glasses and something else, and I don't remember what it was. Anyway, they went to Mother and asked her if it was true. She made me go to them and apologize and say it wasn't. It was a wonderful lesson for me. I did have lots of styes after that, though, and many times my eyes would be stuck shut with styes, and I would have an awful time before I got to school. In September, I started school in the 4th grade. I probably was a year older than many, and surely the tallest. I fail to say I started kindergarten when I was 6. Having a birthday in October, the folks were given the choice of sending me or keeping me out another year, and Mother wanted me to stay home. Elston Elementary was the closest to the beach area, a couple blocks south of the harbor. It was the poorest and oldest school in town. Creaky wood floors, bathrooms with no doors on them, and a playground no bigger than the school. Well, it was torn down a few years after I was out of there. I remember at recess time, Jane, Margaret, and I would take dill pickles to eat during recess. Can you imagine what that room must have smelled like after we got back in? My best friend from 4th grade on through the 12th was Anita Calvert, Neat, as everybody called her. I had never been around black children before, but we all learned to love Vashti Campbell. She was a character. In Three Rivers, I liked a boy by the name of Peter Bojo, but he was a dark-skinned Italian boy whose father raised the sweetest purple onions you ever tasted. Uncle Frank and Aunt Laura owned 14 cottages for rent by people who came out every summer from Chicago. During the Depression, the cottages didn't rent. Uncle Frank and Aunt Laura would rent for a week or anything they could get because that was their only income. Judy has some of Aunt Laura's diaries that reflect that. In the winter, we all lived in Kilcare. It had a furnace. It was on Lakeshore Drive and within the city limits. In the spring and fall, there was lots of work getting the places ready and closed up for the winter. Today, I imagine the beach is probably 99% filled with year-round residents. Uncle Frank and Aunt Laura had 2 women year after year cleaning, Mrs. Geike and Mrs. Piszczek. At noon, Aunt Laura fixed a big boiled dinner, went to get the women in whichever cottage they were working, and brought them back to Kilcare to feed them. Once in a while it was mutton stew, and I sure didn't like that. In the spring, bright flowered cretonne was bought for the curtains, for the windows and closets and cupboards, and also for the cots and beds. And the sewing machines hummed. Mother was a great help with that. In the winter, strips of cotton material were sewed together and rolled in balls, and Aunt Laura would take them to a woman in the part of town that was called Canada, where she made them into rag rugs for the cottages. The Glidden brothers were a close-knit group. Uncle Ori and Uncle Asa had to go to by Kilcare when they were going to town, and they always stopped in. And there were trips to Lakeside to see Uncle Emery and Aunt Carrie. Then there was a sister, Aunt Hattie, who married Uncle Mott Wire. They lived out in the country from Three Oaks. Their children were Esther, Evelyn, Lottie, Dorothy, Cecil, and Ted. Cecil was a girl, just a little older than I was, and she used to come and spend time with us. There were also 2 other Glidden sisters, Viola and Elmira. When Dad built a house for Uncle Ori and Aunt Ollie, just a couple of lots along the beach from where Chet and Renee lived, and I'll talk about that later. He had a billiard table, and Dad and Uncle Frank used to love to go play when they had the time. Dad went from the Buick to a new open black Ford. Well, it was so much lighter than the Buick, we felt like we were going around corners on 2 wheels. We were so high up off the ground. It wasn't long before he went back to another Buick, this time a maroon sport model with maroon leather-covered cushions and a khaki top. Of course, all cars then had running boards. I remember we were in a big rainstorm once in the Ford, and I manually moved the windshield back and forth so Dad could see. It was raining so hard he wasn't able to do it himself, and of course they weren't automatic in those days. These cars also had side curtains that had to be snapped into place with they had isinglass small windows, a forerunner of glass. It was some trick if you got caught in a storm. You were frequently soaked before you could get them on. Shortly after we got to Michigan City, the folks looked for a church. There were German and Swedish Lutherans, but not any like they were used to. So we joined the Congregational Church. Reverend Hall was the minister. It was certainly a pretty dead church and never did grow. In fact, it did the opposite. But Mother was active in the women's groups, and I went to a so-called youth group. At one time, I took organ lessons on the big 3-manual organ. I could practice for free because they thought someday I would play for their services. I had to go down in the basement and turn a water valve, which activated the organ. One day when I was going down from home to practice, I caught my thumb in the garage door and tore the nail off. That was the end of my organ experience. I really wasn't enjoying it anyway. After a couple years living with other folks, Dad said, "No place is big enough for 2 families." I think maybe they were having a little trouble with meddling about me, and one of the things I know Aunt Laura was forever saying, stand up straight, get straight." I guess I rebelled. They thought I was being pampered, and I probably was. Anyway, he bought a lot and planned our 2-story, 5-bedroom house with just 1 bathroom. Who ever heard of 2 in one house? It was still in Sheridan Beach within the city limits, just a couple of bus stops further up the beach from Kilcare. We first had pretty yellow awnings across the front and casement windows all over the downstairs. There were only 2 handles for the windows, so when an unexpected storm would come up off the lake, it was impossible to get the windows closed and the awnings up. So we just gave up on the awnings when they wore out. While we were still at Kilcare, Mother and Aunt Laura, she could drive, were going to town, and I asked if I could go along, and they said sure. Well, when we got there, they took me to a dentist's office. I probably was well in need of them by now, but I thought it was a pretty sneaky, dirty trick. The 5 of us, Aunt Laura and Uncle Frank, Mother, Dad, and I, would go into Chicago every winter to see the ice skate show with Sonia Henney. And I can remember her yet. One of her trademarks, after her production, she would start at one end of the rink and get up steam and skate on one leg backwards, clear to the other end where somebody pulled the curtains open, and she skated right through them. And every time we saw her, that was what she did. And in the wintertime, or no, in the summertime, we would go and see the House of David baseball team play. After we were moved into our new house, my friends were the Calverts, Anita Calvert, everybody called her Neat. I guess I repeated that. But anyway, she had 2 brothers and a sister. And Owen Nicewarner lived across the street for me, and the Clarks and the Arndt's kids. We would play hide and seek at night under the street lights, and us older kids would always run up on one of the sand dunes or get away and leave the little kids standing there, and they never could find us. And during the day, of course, we would all be down swimming, and there never was an adult around, but we knew about undertows, and I guess because there were enough of us, they trusted us. In the winter, we would climb on the ice banks, and that was probably more dangerous maybe than swimming, because we would climb up and watch the water come swishing underneath, just hollowing out the ice bank, and I suppose it could have collapsed on us, I don't know. We kids loved the fall of the year when the Chicago people all went back and the lake would get rough. We'd play with the waves, seeing how far we could get down before they broke and still get back without getting wet. Of course, we made sandcastles and forts, particularly when the lake was rough. We were all so tan by the end of the summer. No sunscreen in those days, and the dermatologist tells me I'm paying for it now. The sand dunes that we used to climb on to play are all gone, washed down to make room for more roads and cottages. Mr. Calvert was a photographer, and since they lived a little farther up the beach, they would stop and take me to school. I hated to get up in the morning, and Mother would call and call. One morning, she left me alone after calling, and Calvert's came, and I wasn't up yet. They waited for me to get dressed, bless them. Don't know that it taught me a lesson, because I still don't like to get up. We used to drive home at noon for lunch, too, and I held a pie that Mr. Calvert bought for their lunch every day at the bakery below his studio. Mrs. Calvert didn't like to cook, and one time when we were marooned in town by a snowstorm, she just had flour in the house and some oleo. The 2 girls died of diabetes, but the boys are still living. Once, while we were going to school, they had a Ford sedan, and we were riding along on Franklin Street, and all of a sudden, down went one corner of the car. The wheel just doubled under. It didn't come off. It just doubled under. So Nate and Pep and I really had to run to get to school on time. Twice we had to stay in town because of a snowdrift on the beach. Once with a girlfriend, Grace Algram, and once Nate and I stayed at the Spaulding Hotel. We got home on a Friday night by walking along the beach next to the ice banks where the wind had swept the snow off clear down to the sand. The next day, the snow plows had gotten through to our houses. I had always thought one of Neat's habits was kind of strange. She insisted on eating the oleo, which looked like lard, before they squeezed the little yellow pellet into it and stirred it up and made it look like butter. Mother was a great cook, but not a very good teacher. I liked to bake, but she didn't go by recipes, just how the batter looked or felt. One day she was helping me make a pie crust. It wouldn't roll out right, and we were having a good argument. Uncle Frank came in about this time, and Mother said, "You don't want any of this pie. There's too much pepper in it." We used to go back to visit Grandma Pugsley once in a while. We could never tell her when we were coming because Dad never knew what his schedule was. And if it was in cold weather, she would be sitting with her feet on the register with her pot of green tea beside them. And her greeting was always a surprised, "Well said." When I was in 6th grade, we went to Florida. Grandma Glidden suffered with inflammatory rheumatism and tic douloureux, which is an excruciating, painful facial nerve disease. Many times I saw her sit so in pain that her tongue just shook, and she would give herself shots for pain and then forget and give herself another one. I learned later that she was probably a morphine addict. Anyway, Dad and Aunt Laura thought she might benefit getting into warmer weather. It turned out to be one of the coldest winters on record in Florida, so if warm weather would help, we would never know. I don't know how it was decided, but Mother took Grandma down on the train, and Dad drove our maroon sport model. The year he bought it, his income was $17,000, more than he had ever made. Uncle Asa, another of Uncle Frank's brothers, was in the front seat with him, and Grandma Pugsley and I were wedged in the back seat. There was a small trunk on the back of the car with a suitcase that fit inside of it, and luggage racks on the running board. We could only get out of one side of the car. I don't know how long we were on the road, but in the Cumberland Mountains, we got on a road that was being repaired by putting slate or shale or flagstone rocks, I don't know which they were, but they were placed in vertical position with the sharp edges sticking up. Dad was assured it was safe to drive on because they were wedged in so tight together, so we proceeded slowly. That night we stayed out in the country in a big, square, 2-story brick house, real old, with windows to the floor and very high ceilings. We could get our evening meal there, and breakfast too. I don't remember the rest of the meal, but I wondered why they served cream of wheat with it. It was my introduction to grits. One day, Grandma said she really had to go to the bathroom. Well, we were out in the country, so Dad stopped at a run-down-looking house, the only one in sight, and asked if we could use their toilet. And the man said, "We ain't got none." And Dad said, "Well, where do you go?" And the man waved his arms and said, "Oh, around." I guess we were off schedule because the next night we stayed up over a store, and the small town must have been a crossroad for trains. Not much sleep that night. Among other places, I remember we stayed in Valdosta, Georgia. And then I think we made it to Clearwater, our destination. There, because Aunt Minnie Hall and her daughters, Louise Hall and Marjorie McMillan, and Marjorie's daughter, Lucille, had moved there from Mattawan, and they were distant relatives some way. I think Grandma Pugsley stayed with Aunt Minnie because her girls didn't. The rest of us rented the downstairs of a fairly large house. The landlords lived upstairs. As I said, it was cold, and Uncle Ace put newspapers under his mattress. He said it kept him kept the cold air from getting to him, but every time he moved, they rattled and kept him awake. Dad and Uncle Ace used to love to go fishing out on the Causeway Bridge. They liked catching mackerel, but not the blowfish, which blew up in a round ball when caught and made it impossible to get the hook out of its mouth. And it wasn't any fun getting mixed up with jellyfish either. And we'd go to the baseball games not far from our place, and I've forgotten which team had spring training there. Every time a trip was planned to the beach, there was always the question as to whether I could go or not. Dad was tutoring me and thought I should stay home and study, but I had a lot of help on my side, and I don't think I missed very much. One day, Mother sent me to the store to get some Fel's Naphtha soap, and the clerk looked so puzzled and finally said, "Oh, you all's from the north. We don't have things like that." Dad bought an orange tree for the winter, and any time we wanted oranges, we'd go and pick some. One of the crazy ideas going around about that time was how good garlic was for you. So folks, company and all, made fresh garlic sandwiches and ate them before they went to bed at night. It seems we had lots of visitors. Aunt Emma and Uncle Lou Tower, Aunt Jen and Uncle Hiram Chapin, Grandma Glidden's brother and his wife, and their daughter, and Esther Wire and Uncle Ori and Aunt Ollie. We also had the only car, so when folks wanted to go to Tampa to the state fair, Dad took them. I went many of the times, and before we left there, I would get a cone with bright orange ice cream, supposedly made with fresh orange juice. It wasn't always easy to convince my folks that it was really good for me. I think it cost 15 cents, and that was an awful lot of money, and it probably wasn't what they said it was anyway. We also took trips to Tarpon Springs to see the divers dive for money in the clear water. And I think it was there also that we saw lots of sponges that grew in the water. And we took a trip to up the Anclote River because we were assured that we would see alligators. Well, we never did. But we saw a place that I guess is in literature called Inverness. We went to Melbourne, across the state from us, to visit Haven, Ruth, and Harry Lee, their adopted son. Ruth was the daughter of Emery Glidden, another brother of Uncle Frank's, and his wife, Aunt Carrie. It was a memorable trip, for without warning, way out in the middle of nowhere, we were told we would have to drive the car up on a flat car and be transported across the Everglades, as there was no road, even though the map showed there was one. The railroad track was up on pilings of about 4 or 5 feet up above the marshy stuff, and sitting in the car, it was scary, as you would see the flat car move up and down, and we were told we might see alligators, but we never did. The only time we ever saw alligators were in captivity. Kissimmee was at the end of the trip, as I remember it. Needless to say, we found a different way going home. We spent Christmas with them and went out to the Atlantic Ocean beach.